The night Hollywood held its breath. They called them the Rat Pack, the coolest men who ever lived. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board. Dean Martin, the king of cool. Together, they owned Las Vegas. They owned Hollywood. They owned the world. But on one terrible night in the spring of 1958, at the height of their fame, these two titans nearly destroyed each other. And in the process, they almost killed one of the richest men in America. This is not the sanitized story you've heard before. This is not the Hollywood fairy tale of two buddies who occasionally disagreed. This is a true story of a night when rage consumed reason, when alcohol fueled fury, and when two men who loved each other like brothers came within inches of committing an act they could never take back. This is the story of the night Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra's friendship exploded into violence so brutal that witnesses would spend decades trying to forget what they saw. The location was the private lounge of the Formosa Cafe in West Hollywood, a legendary watering hole where stars went to escape the cameras and drink themselves into oblivion. The date was April 19, 1958. The room was filled with Hollywood royalty, industry power brokers, and one particular millionaire businessman whose name has been scrubbed from most historical accounts, but whose near death that night would send shockwaves through the entertainment industry. By the time the sun rose on April 20th, blood would be spilled, reputations would be shattered, and the golden image of the Rat Pack would be forever tarnished beneath the surface. Two kings, one kingdom. To understand how the night descended into chaos, you have to understand the complicated, combustible relationship between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. On the surface, they were brothers. Frank called Dean Dago with affection. Dean called Frank the Pope with a mixture of reverence and mockery. They made movies together. They performed together. They drank together. They chased women together. To the world, they were inseparable. But beneath that carefully crafted image of effortless camaraderie lurked something darker. Frank Sinatra was a control freak. He needed to be the center of attention, the alpha in every room, the sun around which all other stars orbited. He had clawed his way back from obscurity in the early 50s, rebuilding his career through sheer force of will and talent. Frank demanded loyalty. He demanded obedience. He surrounded himself with people who would bend to his vision, his schedule, his whims. Dean Martin was different. Dean didn't bend for anyone. While Frank needed the spotlight, Dean merely tolerated it. While Frank courted power and befriended presidents, Dean just wanted to play golf and go home to his family. Dean's coolness was an act. It was armor. He had learned long ago in Steubenville, Ohio, that the world would take everything from you if you let it. So you kept your guard up. You stayed detached. You never let anyone see you sweat. Not even Frank Sinatra. This fundamental difference in their personalities created a fault line in their friendship. Frank couldn't stand that Dean didn't need him the way everyone else did. Dean couldn't stand that Frank expected him to jump when commanded. Frank saw Dean's independence as a betrayal. Dean saw Frank's demands as an insult. For years, they papered over these tensions with jokes and booze, and the shared glory of being the two biggest stars in entertainment. But tension, like pressure in a volcano, always find a way to erupt. The specific trigger for that night's violence had been building for months. Frank had become increasingly possessive of the Rat Pack brand. He wanted complete control over their joint appearances, their performances, their public image. He was negotiating deals without consulting Dean. He was making commitments on Dean's behalf without asking permission. He was treating Dean like an employee rather than an equal partner. Dean, who valued his autonomy above all else, was seething. He had started turning down Frank's invitations. He had started making excuses to avoid Rat Pack gatherings. Frank, paranoid and sensitive to any perceived slight, took this as a declaration of war. In the weeks leading up to April 19th, their communication had devolved into passive-aggressive barbs delivered through mutual friends. Frank told people Dean was getting soft, that he was whipped by his wife, that he didn't have the stamina for the lifestyle anymore. Dean told people Frank was a tyrannical egomaniac who couldn't stand anyone getting applause that wasn't directed at him. The mutual respect that had once bound them was disintegrating. All that remained was wounded pride and accumulated resentment, a toxic mixture waiting for a match. The powder keg ignites. April 19th, 1958, started innocently enough. There was a small gathering planned at the Formosa Cafe, one of those informal industry mixers where deals were made and alliances were forged over martinis and steaks. The host was a film producer named Harold Mirish, and among the guests were directors, studio executives, starlets, and businessmen eager to rub shoulders with Hollywood royalty. Frank Sinatra arrived early with his entourage, as he always did, immediately commanding the room's attention. He was in rare form that night, telling stories, singing snippets of songs, holding court like the king he believed himself to be. Dean Martin arrived an hour later, deliberately. He knew Frank was there. He knew Frank expected him to seek him out immediately, to pay homage, to acknowledge Frank's dominance of the social hierarchy. Instead, Dean walked past Frank's table with barely a nod, sat at the bar, ordered a scotch, and struck up a conversation with a young actress whose name has been lost to history. It was a calculated slight, and everyone in the room recognized it. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. Frank's face darkened. He sent one of his guys, probably Jilly Rizzo, over the bar to summon Dean to his table. Dean looked at Jilly, smiled that sleepy smile of his, and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "Tell Francis I'm busy." The use of Frank's birth name, Francis, was deliberate. It was something Dean only did when he wanted to needle Frank, to remind him of the working-class Italian roots that Frank spent his life trying to transcend. Jilly returned to Frank's table and whispered the message. Frank's jaw clenched. His fingers tightened around his glass. But he didn't move. Not yet. The real explosion came when the millionaire entered the room. His name was Robert Winthrop Harrison III, though he went by Rob. He was an oil tycoon from Texas, worth somewhere north of $50 million in 1958 money, which would be well over $500 million today. Rob Harrison was in Hollywood trying to break into film production. He had money, ambition, and a dangerous combination of arrogance and naivete. He had been courting both Frank and Dean separately, promising financing for projects, offering them points on potential films, dangling the kind of money that even established stars noticed. The problem was that Rob had made promises to both men that contradicted each other. He had told Frank he wanted to finance a Sinatra-led production company, where Frank would have complete creative control. He had told Dean he wanted to finance a Dean Martin vehicle, a comedy western that Dean had been developing. Neither man knew about the other's deal. Rob, operating under the assumption that Hollywood was just business and everything could be smoothed over with enough cash, walked into the Formosa that night planning to announce a joint venture that would somehow satisfy both stars. He was catastrophically wrong. Rob made his entrance, working the room, shaking hands, playing the big shot. He approached Frank's table first, as protocol demanded. Frank, still stewing over Dean's snub, greeted Rob warmly, seeing an opportunity. Frank loudly announced at the table that he and Rob were about to change the entertainment industry, that they were forming a partnership that would produce the biggest films Hollywood had ever seen. He said it loud enough for Dean to hear. It was bait. Dean took it. He stood up from the bar, scotch in hand, and walked over to Frank's table. The room went silent. Everyone could feel it. The confrontation that had been brewing for months was finally here. Dean looked at Rob with something between pity and contempt, then turned to Frank. "Funny," Dean said, his voice carrying that dangerous casualness he used when he was truly angry. "Rob here told me last week that he was financing my picture. Didn't mention anything about you, Francis." Frank's face went from tan to crimson in 2 seconds. He turned to Rob, who had suddenly realized he was standing in a minefield. "Is that true?" Frank demanded. Rob, trying to salvage the situation, stammered something about how there was plenty of money for everyone, how both projects could move forward, how this was all a misunderstanding. It was the worst possible answer, because what Rob's stammering revealed was that he'd been playing both sides, making promises he couldn't keep, treating Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin like they were interchangeable commodities he could manipulate for his own gain. Frank stood up so fast his chair fell backward. "You played me," he said to Rob, his voice tight and low. Then he turned to Dean. "And you knew about this?" Dean, who actually hadn't known about Frank's deal with Rob until 30 seconds ago, could have de-escalated. He could have said no, could have expressed his own surprise, could have joined Frank in confronting Rob's duplicity. But Dean was tired. Tired of Frank's ego. Tired of Frank's games. Tired of always having to manage Frank's emotions. So instead, Dean shrugged and said, "I know you like to think you're the only star in Hollywood, Frank, but some of us have our own deals." That was the match. That was the moment the powder keg exploded. When cool turned to rage. Frank moved first. He lunged across the table, not at Rob, but at Dean. Years of accumulated resentment, jealousy, and wounded pride came pouring out in one violent surge. He grabbed Dean by the lapels of his perfectly tailored jacket and shoved him backward. Dean, caught off guard by the sudden physicality, stumbled back into a cocktail waitress, sending a tray of drinks crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering glass cut through the shocked silence like a gunshot. For a moment, everyone froze. This wasn't supposed to happen. These were sophisticated men, titans of the entertainment industry, not street brawlers. But Dean Martin didn't freeze for long. He had grown up in the rough Italian neighborhoods of Steubenville. He had fought in back alleys and bars before he ever sang a note. And while he spent his adult life projecting an image of effortless sophistication, underneath the tuxedo was a guy who knew how to handle himself when things got ugly. Dean came up swinging. His fist connected with Frank's jaw with a crack that sounded like a baseball bat hitting a fastball. Frank's head snapped to the side, and for a second his knees buckled. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. The room gasped collectively. Someone, probably one of the women, screamed. But Frank didn't go down. Frank Sinatra was a lot of things, but he was not a quitter. He steadied himself, touched his bleeding mouth, looked at the blood on his fingers, and then something primal took over. Frank came at Dean like a man possessed. He threw wild, haymaker punches that had more fury than technique. One caught Dean on the cheekbone. Another glanced off his shoulder. Dean blocked most of them, but he was backing up, trying to create space, trying to find room to think. The two men crashed into tables and chairs. People scattered, pressing themselves against the walls. Too shocked to intervene, too terrified to look away. And then Rob Harrison made a fatal mistake. He tried to step between them. He was motivated by some combination of guilt, panic, and the misguided belief that his money gave him authority over the situation. He grabbed Frank's arm mid-swing, shouting something about everyone calming down, about being reasonable. Frank, consumed by adrenaline and rage, didn't see a peacemaker. He saw an obstacle. He spun on Rob and shoved him with both hands, putting all his strength and fury into it. Rob flew backward, his arms windmilling, his feet leaving the ground. He traveled 6 feet through the air before his body collided with the edge of the bar. There was a sickening thud, the sound of skull meeting solid oak. Rob crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just lay there, a spreading pool of blood beginning to form under his head. The room went from chaos to absolute silence in an instant. Everyone stared at Rob's motionless body. Frank stared at Rob's motionless body. Dean stared at Rob's motionless body. The rage that consumed them both 30 seconds ago evaporated, replaced by something infinitely worse. Horror. Because suddenly they all realized that what had started as a fight between two angry men had become something far more serious. They might have just witnessed a murder. Someone, a woman whose voice was shaking, said, "Oh my God, he's not moving." Another voice, male, urgent, "Call an ambulance." Jesus Christ, call an ambulance. People unfroze, rushing toward Rob, toward the phones, toward any kind of action that might change what had just happened. Dean knelt beside Rob, checking for a pulse with hands that were suddenly trembling. Frank stood frozen, his face drained of color, staring at the man he had just thrown into a bar with enough force to crack his skull. "He's breathing," Dean said, his voice cutting through the panic. "He's alive. Someone get a doctor. Now." The relief was palpable but temporary. Rob might be alive, but he was badly hurt, possibly dying. The blood pool was growing larger. His breathing was shallow and irregular. And in that moment, as they waited for help to arrive, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin stood on opposite sides of a body that represented the wreckage of their friendship and possibly the end of their careers. The man who nearly died. Rob Harrison didn't die that night. He came very close. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes. though it felt like hours to everyone in that room. The paramedics stabilized him, loaded him onto a stretcher, and rushed him to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. The diagnosis was severe: a fractured skull, a severe concussion, and internal bleeding in his brain. The doctors told his family, who arrived from Texas on an emergency flight, that the next 48 hours would determine whether he lived or died, and if he lived, whether he would ever be the same man again. Rob spent 3 days in a coma. During those 3 days, Frank Sinatra aged 10 years. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He sat in his home in Palm Springs, chain-smoking and staring at the phone, waiting for news that would determine his fate. Would Rob die? If he died, would it be manslaughter? Would Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who sang at presidential inaugurations, spend the rest of his life in prison? The questions tormented him. He had killed men before, metaphorically, with his power and his vindictiveness. But he had never physically hurt someone so badly. He had never seen that much blood. He had never had to confront the possibility that his rage could end a human life. Dean Martin, meanwhile, retreated into his own private hell. He felt responsible. If he hadn't provoked Frank, if he hadn't been so stubborn, if he had just walked over to Frank's table when he arrived and said hello like a normal person, none of this would have happened. Rob would be fine. Frank wouldn't be facing potential criminal charges. The Rat Pack wouldn't be on the verge of collapse. Dean told himself it was his fault, even though logically he knew that Frank had thrown the man. Frank had caused the injury. But Dean had created the conditions. He had lit the fuse. On the 4th day, Rob Harrison woke up. He opened his eyes, groggy and confused, with no memory of the past week. The doctors ran tests. The bleeding had stopped. The swelling in his brain was receding. He would live. He would recover. Against all odds, Robert Winthrop Harrison III would walk out of that hospital 6 weeks later with nothing worse than some persistent headaches and a titanium plate in his skull. It was, by any measure, a miracle, but the miracle came with strings attached. Rob's family, horrified by what had happened and furious at the Hollywood culture that had nearly killed their son, wanted blood. They wanted Frank Sinatra prosecuted. They wanted Dean Martin prosecuted. They wanted everyone in that room who had witnessed the assault to testify. They hired the most aggressive lawyers in California and prepared to wage war on the entertainment industry. For about 5 days, it looked like Frank and Dean were finished. The scandal was about to break wide open. Arrests were imminent. Careers were over. And then something very Hollywood happened. Money changed hands. Lots of money. The Harrison family was rich, but the combined resources of Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, and every studio and power broker who had a vested interest in protecting the Rat Pack was richer. Settlements were negotiated. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Lawyers worked overtime to bury the incident under layers of legal paperwork and hush money. The official story became that Rob had suffered an unfortunate accident, that he had slipped and fallen in a crowded restaurant, that it was nobody's fault. The witnesses were paid off or intimidated into silence. The paramedics and hospital staff were persuaded to keep their mouths shut. Within 2 weeks, the whole incident had been scrubbed from public record. It never appeared in the newspapers. It never showed up in police reports. It became a ghost story, whispered about in Hollywood circles, but never confirmed, never proven. Rob Harrison took his multi-million-dollar settlement and went back to Texas, where he stayed far away from the entertainment industry for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about what happened. The non-disclosure agreement he signed saw to that. But for the people who were in that room, the truth was branded into their memories forever. They had seen Frank Sinatra nearly kill a man. They had seen Dean Martin's fist split Frank's lip. They had seen the king of cool and the chairman of the board reduced to brawling animals. And no amount of money or legal maneuvering could erase that truth, the aftermath that changed everything. In the days and weeks following the incident, Frank and Dean did what was expected of them. They appeared together at public events. They smiled for photographers. They performed together in Las Vegas, singing and joking and playing the roles that had made them famous. To the outside world, nothing had changed. The Rat Pack was still intact, still cool, still the envy of every man in America. But anyone who looked closely could see the cracks. There was a stiffness between them now, a formality that hadn't existed before. The easy banter was gone, replaced by scripted interactions that fell hollow. They didn't look at each other the same way. When they spoke, it was with the careful politeness of distant colleagues, not the rough affection of brothers. The magic that made them elected together, that indefinable chemistry that audiences had loved, had evaporated that night at the Formosa Cafe. Frank tried to apologize multiple times. He sent Dean gifts, expensive watches, and custom-made golf clubs. He had mutual friends reach out. He even, in one moment of vulnerability witnessed by Sammy Davis Jr., broke down and admitted that he had been wrong, that his ego had gotten out of control, that he was sorry for everything. But sorry doesn't undo seeing your friend consumed by rage. Sorry doesn't erase the memory of violence. Dean accepted the apologies with grace, but he never forgot. He couldn't forget. The incident also changed how they worked together. Before that night, their collaboration had been spontaneous and free-flowing. They would improvise on stage, play off each other's energy, create moments of genuine joy. After that night, everything became choreographed. They planned their performances down to the minute. They stayed in their lanes. They maintained physical distance. It was professional, efficient, and utterly soulless. The audience didn't know what they were missing, but the people backstage could feel it. The heart had gone out of the Rat Pack. Perhaps the most tragic consequence was the end of their personal friendship. They stopped spending time together off camera. They stopped calling each other just to talk. They stopped being there for each other in the ways that real friends are. When Dean's son Dino Jr. died in 1987, Frank attended the funeral, but there was a distance between them even in grief. They had once been men who would have wept together, who would have held each other up. Now they were men who exchanged formal condolences and moved on. The violence of that night had severed something essential, something that could never be repaired, the scars that never healed. The story of the fight between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra is ultimately a story about the price of fame and the fragility of friendship. These were two men who had everything: talent, wealth, adoration, power. But they couldn't hold on to each other. They let pride and ego and the toxic culture of Hollywood poison the one thing that mattered most: their brotherhood. In his final years, after Frank's death in 1998, people would occasionally ask Dean about their friendship. Dean, diminished by age and grief, would usually deflect with a joke. But once, talking to a friend over dinner, he let his guard down. "Frank and I," he said, staring into his wine glass, "we could have conquered the world together. Instead, we almost killed a man and each other over nothing. Over pride. Over who got to be the biggest star. It was the stupidest thing I've ever done, and I've done some stupid things." It was as close as Dean Martin ever came to admitting regret. The incident at the Formosa Cafe remained buried for decades. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, after Dean's death, and as Frank's health was failing, that small pieces of the story began to leak out. Rob Harrison had died in 1994, releasing some of the witnesses from their non-disclosure agreements. A few people talked to biographers, always off the record, always anonymously. The full story has never been officially confirmed. It remains one of Hollywood's darkest secrets, a reminder that behind the glamour and the legend, these men were human, flawed, violent, broken humans who made terrible choices in moments of rage. Today, when we watch old Rat Pack performances, when we see Dean and Frank singing side by side, smiling and loose and apparently carefree, we're watching men wearing masks. We're watching them pretend that nothing happened, that the violence never occurred, that their friendship wasn't shattered on a blood-stained floor in West Hollywood. We're watching the greatest performance of their lives, the performance of brotherhood long after the brotherhood had died. The lesson, if there is one, is this: success means nothing if you lose yourself in the pursuit of it. Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra achieved everything they wanted except the one thing that truly mattered. They wanted to be legends, and they became legends. But in becoming legends, they stopped being friends. And on one terrible night in April 1958, they nearly became something far worse: murderers. The scars from that night never healed. They just learned to hide them better. The way Hollywood has always hidden its ugliest truths behind spotlights and smiles and songs that make us forget, for a little while, that even our heroes can fall.